Welcome to an episode of The Conversation, our 20th episode here on FCTV. Delighted that you are making the time to spend some time with us, and we hope that you will enjoy the conversation. Tonight's subject is one that is becoming very popular, that's in the news a lot. It's on Juneteenth, and we are going to be discussing the history of this new federal holiday, why people should celebrate it, and perhaps more importantly, why don't we know more about it? And so we have a distinguished group of panelists to be with us. I'm glad to be joined by our co-host, the Vice Chair of the Select Board of Falmouth, the Honorable Onjalé Scott Price, to share in this conversation. But we're going to hear from some people on the street first to see what they have to say in response to the question, what is Juneteenth?
Yeah, so Juneteenth as a specific event is a moment in history in June 19th, 1865, when General Granger, Union General Granger, occupied or came to Galveston and read the sort of General Order Number 3, which announced the freeing of the slaves, the end of slavery in the United States. It was late in Texas because of the distance of Texas from the East Coast, from a lot of the fighting and from the centers of power, and so Texas was sort of the last state in which this order was brought by federal troops, which also allowed the enforcement of the order to begin with. So it's unique in that way, in that it was really the last moment, the last defeated Confederate state to sort of have this sort of official federal union pronouncement of the freeing of, or the ending of slavery.
Juneteenth happened on June 19th, 1865. General Gordon Granger of the Union Army headed to Galveston, Texas, to take over the Ashton Villa from the Confederate Army. On the balcony, he read the Emancipation Proclamation to everyone there, including the enslaved people. This was the last day of slavery, so it was a day of celebration. It's also known as Jubilee Day. And so this is my my quilt, my Juneteenth quilt, and I show on here Juneteenth, June 19, 1865, Ashton Villa here in Texas. Here you have General Gordon Granger. It says Emancipation Proclamation. Here we have freedom, and at the bottom you have the enslaved. Let's see if we can see it better. The enslaved people rejoicing. And in this quilt, I put cotton along the bottom, cotton here, and I have the American flag, and I have the Juneteenth flag. So that's really what Juneteenth is about.
Basically, we were still in the throes of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, he had actually freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, two and a half years earlier, on January 1st, 1863. And what the Emancipation Proclamation basically said was that any slaves that were being held in any of the Confederate states were now free. Well, somehow that little tidbit of information did not get back to the slaves in Texas. Unfortunately, Texas hadn't seen much fighting of during the Civil War, so they suspect that might, have had something to do with it. You also saw, as the Civil War got, bloodier, you saw a lot of slave owners retreat and actually take their slaves to Texas to live. There's also the thought, and I'm sure it's definitely the truth, that a lot of slave owners did not tell the slaves that they were free because they wanted to wait till after harvest season, believe it or not. So I'm not surprised by this, being a history teacher. Basically, that's what Juneteenth is.
I think one of the things that people often associate it with is Freedom Day. It's another way of thinking about it. we've spent some time in talking with students about the Emancipation Proclamation for so long, and shifting towards really having them focus on the primary source text of General Order Number 3, which, you know, the 2-year timeline in between, and communicating that to students. But I think what's most important is in our conversations, talking about the fact that it's not a day off from school or work to rest. It's not a day for commercialization, but really a day for learning and education and reflection. But we can't isolate it to that day. It has to be something that has a rippling effect in our actions, in our conversations, and really starts to reshape our culture and how we look at each other and what our thinking is around racial and social justice. So I think Juneteenth coming up to that level of being denoted as a holiday elevates our consciousness and opens a conversation, but it's really a day about looking at who we are as a country, thinking about the conflict and the strife in our past, and collectively elevating that consciousness to push us forward, to be a better society, one that embraces everyone.
Well, welcome back to the conversation, and thanks to our people on the street who were able to help us begin to understand what Juneteenth is. Just what is Juneteenth? I know in our church on Sunday of Juneteenth, I said to the congregation, I bet if I asked you all how many of you have heard of Juneteenth or know what Juneteenth is, most of you wouldn't be able to answer the question. And I didn't embarrass anyone. I didn't ask anybody to raise their hand if they knew or didn't know about Juneteenth. But I saw a lot of heads nodding like, no, I really don't know what Juneteenth is. So we're going to begin with that question. And I'm going to ask Lamerchi Frazier from the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket to respond. First of all, welcome Lamerchi. Lamerchi is a visual artist. We have a chance to see some of her work on the wall behind her. She's a public historian and an innovator. She also is well-versed in cross-cultural competencies and topics. She's held residencies in Brazil, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Africa, France, and Cuba. And she is a recent award recipient of the first Museum Educator Award by the Massachusetts Council on Social Studies. So we are thrilled to have you with us, Lamerchi, and ask you to begin by just explaining to us. Somebody asked you, what is Juneteenth?
Okay.
What do you say?
Well, first of all, I would like to preface that with acknowledging that we are on the land of the indigenous people and their descendants, and
Amen.
they are our hosts, and we agree to be their good guests.
Amen.
So,
amen.
With that, I can say that Juneteenth is a moment. It is June 19th, 1865. It is when General Order Number 3 is read to the people who are enslaved in Galveston, Texas, as an announcement of the executive order signed by Abraham Lincoln that denotes slavery is over. Slavery has ended in all Confederate territories, and due to the fall of Richmond, Virginia, 2 months before that, in April of 1865, you have news shared with the people who are in Galveston, Texas. When we look at General Order Number 3, it says that the people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation is the one that they're referring to, from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existed between them become that between employer and hired labor. The freed, we need to pay attention to this, are advised to remain at their present homes quietly. They can work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that there will be no idleness tolerated. So that is the order. That is what we need to think about, whether it is a celebration or acknowledgement that we set aside this day. Massachusetts was in 2007 was the 25th state to recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. So the adaptation of this by states has now been circumscribed by a national 2021 issue of this being a holiday. So as we think about Juneteenth, we want to think about the spaces we occupy, what those spaces mean, and what is the challenge that Juneteenth lands for us.
Well, there are several phrases in that order that you read that caught my attention and caused me want to think and make me wonder about why that language, they felt that language was necessary, right? So in my way, it sounds like it's was an effort to continue to control the formerly enslaved.
Yes.
And I appreciate you also raising the point about, is it a celebration or is it an acknowledgement?
Mhm.
And I've had a couple of family members, and actually I'm over here in Connecticut on vacation, and one of our sons was saying to me, "I'm not celebrating that."
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, why not?" I said, it's a national holiday now. It's a federal holiday, and it's about freedom. And he's like, "Nah." He said, I don't think it's anything to celebrate. I think it's, yeah, we want to acknowledge it. And he sort of used your language. So thank you for bringing me back to that,
Yeah.
Lamerchi.
Of course,
I'm
there's
gonna,
joy of being free.
yes, of
However,
course, yes,
it comes with some context.
yes. And it's always important to have the context, which is, I know you're doing at the museum. I'm
Absolutely.
going to bring Barbara Burgo into the conversation now. And Barbara is known, I'm sure, to many folks here on the Cape in the land of the Wampanoag. Thankfully, we'll do that land acknowledgement. She is co-founder and clerk and curator of the Cape Cod Cape Verdean Museum and Cultural Center, located in East Falmouth. She's a former chair of the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission and vice chair of South Coastal County's Legal Services. And she has a number of acknowledgments and awards to her credit. And before we ask you to respond to that question, or maybe respond to what Lamerchi said, Barbara, want to extend to you a belated happy birthday, since your birthday was actually Juneteenth. So I hope you celebrated and not just acknowledged that. I hope you celebrated that. So
Thank you very much.
welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. And so how would you respond to either what Lamerchi said or respond to the question, what is Juneteenth?
Right. So there you go. You kind of stole my thunder, but you honor me. You honor me. I am speaking, as Barbara Burgo, not representative of the museum or anything else like that, because I have some real important things to say about Juneteenth. And what I say to people now, of course, is that well, I try to say first that it is a recognition of the fact that Major General Gordon Granger, the day that he went to Galveston, Texas, to let the slaves know that they were free. Sadly, of course, he went 2 years after the slaves were free, the Emancipation Proclamation. And then I say, so that's first. And then, of course, it was it was I'm sorry, I forgot to shut off my call. It is my birthday. But what I also say was sadly, not only did it take the country 70 years to acknowledge it, but it would have been wonderful had I known as a younger person in high school or earlier or even later, before I got into college in my 40s, that there was even such a celebration in this country of Juneteenth. So it is sad for me and for everyone that it took so long. You don't maybe want to call it a celebration, but again, just so that folks do recognize it with parades and celebrations, I at least want the acknowledgement or the recognition. And it is all about slavery and being free. And I believe I heard you say that it was 2007, I thought. Didn't Massachusetts just recognize it as a holiday in 2020?
No, this was 2007 is on the books for acknowledging that Emancipation Day was real, and that this was the honoring of General Order number 3 being announced to those. So I know what you're referring to, but that's another incident.
Okay. So that's what I wanted to clarify, because as we all know, we are all trying to learn much more of our true history as we go along. And I would love to make sure we clarify it, and even I'm clear. This was my 71st birthday. So it took us until last year when we held a Juneteenth celebration, because it was a Massachusetts and federal holiday, that it's a shame that it has taken so long, and there's so much more to do.
Absolutely, I agree.
Well, let's give clarification to our audience. You raised the question, and I want to make sure our audience has clarity as well about the discrepancy between 2007 and 2021. So, Lamerchi, could you say a word or two more about that?
Well, as Juneteenth rolls out as a celebration in 1866 and going forward, there are states that recognize it as a holiday, and Massachusetts is the 25th to do that. And that happens in 2007. So not necessarily is it a national holiday by that time, and we know that doesn't happen until 2021. But there is some acknowledgement that this was the day. And connected to the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, which is known as Jubilee Day, there is marked confusion about, well, is Juneteenth Jubilee Day, or is the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st Jubilee Day? And so in each case, there is some jubilation. One, when Lincoln has issued the second Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, the first one being one that he and his cabinet had drafted by July of 1862, which would have declared the territory of central Mexico for the enslaved people to occupy. He didn't believe that we could get along together, Black and white, and so he was bent on there being a colony for enslaved people to go to. Frederick Douglass and other Black leaders opposed him and said, oh no, we're not going. No, you got to change that. And so Lincoln, with his cabinet, then revised the Emancipation Proclamation. And by that time, a man whose name was Lewis Hayden had asked Governor Andrew here in Boston to take a message to Lincoln, backed by the Black leaders, to raise the Massachusetts 54 Volunteer Regiment to fight in the Civil War. And so when the second Emancipation Proclamation is actually rendered, January the 1st, everybody's waiting on watch night December the 31st to see that this is going to be done. They're like, oh, we don't believe he's going to sign it. And so there are those who are waiting in Boston in the chapels and different places and music halls to celebrate that moment that it is signed. And it is signed, but on its margin, written in the margin, is the ability for Governor Andrew to be able to raise the Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Regiment, which will be the first Black troop raised in the North to fight in the Civil War. And that becomes a part of a jubilant celebration. And as those soldiers are added to the Union forces, what becomes apparent, even though they do not win their first battle in Fort Wagner, South Carolina, they add to the victory of the war. And it is Richmond, Virginia, that has fallen by April the 2nd, 1865. To give you some context about what happens here is that it is the Confederate capital. And Jefferson Davis, who was head of the Confederacy, leaves 1 month before that. And rather than turn the city over to the Union forces and free the enslaved people, they burn the city. On April the 3rd, colored troops are coming, as they were called. Colored troops are coming into Richmond, and they find people who are enslaved in jails. Sorry about that. They find people who are enslaved in jails and singing songs of being free. And it is that news that reaches the governor of Texas, whose name is Pendleton Murrah, who's been educated at Brown University. He is not willing to be embarrassed by colored troops ushering him and his Confederate troops out of the city. So he flees to Mexico with his troops, with other Confederate officials, so that they won't have to be disgraced by Black men unseating them. So that is another part of why this secluded area of Texas hasn't heard exactly what's happening. But to defy that, the pipeline of news that has been established through Underground Railroad networks, through all kinds of communication systems, has proven that Black people had word of that. They had word of the Emancipation Proclamation, but this is a public announcement. And so when we get to the context of the Civil War and the reason that there has to be the 13th Amendment added to the Constitution to say that slavery is over, that there is no more slavery, and then the 14th issued in 1868 to say that there's the right of Black people to citizenship. Then the 15th Amendment in 1870 that gives the right to vote to Black men. These amendments are necessary in order to enforce what was being people who were kept unfree, even though this Emancipation Proclamation and General Order Number 3 had been issued.
There's a reason you are the Director of Education for the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket.
Well, I don't mean to be so verbose, but if we don't get it right now, I don't know when we're going to get it right.
Oh, I so much appreciate it. I so love it. You have educated me in so many ways. And, you know, one of the things you mentioned, we had a discussion at home about, well, were there Black troops that were involved in going to Galveston, going to Texas? Were they part of that or not? And so maybe we'll come back to that. I want to bring
that's a good question. Thank you.
Bring Dr. Ambrose Gerald in to the conversation. The distinguished Dr. Ambrose Gerald. He's well known to many folks here in this part of the Cape. Dr. Gerald is a retired scientist in fisheries. He's spent a decade as Director of Academic Education in NOAA's fisheries at Woods Hole. He retired in 2016 so he could spend more time with his lovely wife, Anna, and his wife of 47 years, and daughter Saba, and her husband, Mark, and his son, Asa, and his grandchildren. And he's very active in his church. I happen to know that because he's an active member of St. Barnabas Memorial Episcopal Church, where I serve. And our other connection is that he was brought up in North Carolina, in rural North Carolina, and that has influenced his understanding of the world of which he is a part. And I'm delighted that you are a part of our conversation today. Ambrose, I'll call you Ambrose instead of Dr. Gerald, if you don't mind, and ask you to respond to any of what you've heard so far, which has already been rich from Barbara and LaMurchie, or to the question, what is Juneteenth?
Well, thank you. And hello, everyone, again. And let me say from the start that while my background is in the STEM area, or as far as my training and experience and retirement, history is not my specialty. And so I'm here as a man on the street that's just excited about Juneteenth. I first learned about Juneteenth, quite frankly, when I went to graduate school to work on my master's degree at Oklahoma State University. And the secretary of the fishery unit there, the cooperative fishery unit that my research assistantship was through, was an African-American woman from Stillwater, Oklahoma, Helen Murray. And the Murrays celebrated Juneteenth in a big way every year. So that was an education for me to hear about Juneteenth, and then after that to continue to build my not only interest and esteem for it, but knowledge about it. And so what I would add to the conversation is really the question I think that's being asked here. When exactly did legal slavery end in the US? Because it's been pointed out here, we have Juneteenth, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, we have the 13th Amendment, and then we have the issue of what to do about the slaves in the indigenous territories out in the Oklahoma area.
Yes.
The Choctaws, the Cherokees, the Seminoles, the verse 1 owned slaves. And so even after Juneteenth, they had not been freed yet until 1866, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And so that's a question. So it's really, when might you celebrate the end of slavery? But that might not be the important thing here. I think probably an important aspect of this is this is an opportunity for us to be represented, to represent our culture, Black culture, African American culture. It's a time, I believe, to ask the question, what was it like, ending slavery, and what did that all mean, and what did it lead to? And hopefully it's led to our wanting to, with others, Americans, embrace the truth as we seek to understand what it was like to end something as horrible as chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ambrose. So I'm going to ask my co-host to get into the conversation here. She has been listening to all this knowledge you all are dropping on us here, which is much appreciated, and see what Onjalé has to offer to the conversation at this point.
Yeah, there's been a lot of knowledge dropped, really. It really makes me think of how much I don't know and how much I need to learn, but also recognizing that I don't know what I don't know to some extent. So when I think about what Juneteenth is, I realized that I knew what Juneteenth was very young. My family celebrated Juneteenth. I remember probably grade school being one of the people asked to read pieces of the proclamation at a large gathering, like a barbecue that we had. But it's, even though I was in Southern California, my family is from Texas. So they brought that with them to California. So it wasn't something that I saw, that I remember seeing anybody else celebrate, but because they were from Texas and knew about that history, they brought that to California. But there are many years that I did not celebrate Juneteenth, didn't even think about it again, to be honest. You know, but when I think about this year, and this was the first year that I really was involved in some of the planning for the Juneteenth events that happened around town, that I ended up not actually going to, because when I really sat and reflected on the day, like we've been talking about, reflecting on what it is, I felt it was a bit more somber than what I wanted to do in that day. Because when I think about the 2.5 years between, I mean, slavery in general, but the 2.5 years between when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and when the last people in Texas learned of it, I can't imagine what it would have been like to think, well, all these years, but especially these last 2.5 years, I shouldn't have been where I am. I should have been free. And all that those people lost and how they must have felt at that time really put me in a somewhat somber place this particular Juneteenth. So what I decided to do on Juneteenth, instead of going and celebrating and attending various events and talking to people, I decided I was going to support a Black-owned business, and I was going to support a Black person in some way. So I attended the event that Joyce Miller and her husband had at the Katuitt Center for the Arts, and watched their presentation about Juneteenth, and participated in a discussion afterwards. And that's how I felt I wanted to respect or celebrate Juneteenth this year. So I think in talking about what Juneteenth is, I think in celebrating it or not celebrating it, I think can be very personal, more so than I think people give credit to.
Yeah, so Joyce Miller and her husband James are well known to us here on the conversation and at FCTV, and I'm glad you went to that, because they do great work there at Katuitt Center for the Arts. But I want to give you credit, Angie, because when we moved to Falmouth in 2018, you invited me to attend what was the first acknowledgement or recognition of Juneteenth in the town of Falmouth at Peg Noonan Park.
I remember that.
And that's when you and I sort of connected, and so you should take credit for that. And yeah, I'm gonna bring Barbara back and ask it. Barbara, what do you think about is it a celebration? Is it a recognition? Should it be? Is it somber? Is it how? What do you say to that?
All of the above. And
Right.
I concur that it is a personal a point that you take personally and decide to choose which way you would like to celebrate it or acknowledge it or recognize it. So Onjalé, I admire you for doing that. I, of course, got the invitation from Robin and Jim, but because I now am in Falmouth quite a bit, I was asked last December or January if we were doing something at the museum, and I had said we've done the acknowledgement a couple of times. I take it as a teachable moment, a moment to help folks get woke. As the anthropologist, as the person that I am, more the activist, that I said I would love to help collaborate in getting Juneteenth more into the minds and the lives of the people in Falmouth. So I thought my best opportunity would be to collaborate with the superintendent of schools and the school system and with Arts Falmouth. And the 3-day celebration was great. But I mentioned to them, like you hear often, I appreciate that that Arts Falmouth has been doing that, has been using that weekend for whatever, almost 20 years, those 3 days to promote their arts. This year, I said, since it is a national holiday and we have the opportunity, if we could start early on, to make sure this is an intentionally Black Juneteenth, okay, an intentionally Black Arts Falmouth. I know it'll take a while, but I said we have to make sure that we do things to let folks know that if you want them to be included, the BIPOC community, in what you do, you also have to respect what they are doing. So it was my idea to ask Rep. David Vieira if he would help with Jean Morrison. Many of us know her. And that's how that got in the newspapers. Rep. David Vieira, many of you saw, was giving a salute to Jean Morrison. Jean Morrison did a great job helping us get students from the high school. So we tried to get a little bit of everyone involved. Rep. David Vieira did exactly what we heard in the beginning, talk about the General Order 3. He pronounced the Emancipation Proclamation. He dressed up in uniform. Any way we choose to add to this day, or keep it to yourself, however you choose it, it cannot be minimized whatsoever. It really needs to tell folks that I'm sorry, there's a backing up of a truck here. There are ways that each one of us can put our personal take on what we feel and what we see. I must celebrate Juneteenth because it is my birthday. I do feel like maybe I am a little bit touched by grace to have been the Juneteenth baby, because it then meant so much more to me when I realized where they got that name from. So I just say I'm a Juneteenth baby, and I will spend the rest of my life helping educate people on what it means, and you take away from it what you choose to personally.
Yeah, touched by grace. Oh, you're singing my song now. Yeah. Well, yeah. So all of you talked about the lack of education, right? That and the need for continued education around this. I mean, that's what Lamerchie's doing in her work, and Barbara, you're doing as well, and Ambrose as a non-historian is doing it, but as a person who is committed to learning about our people. I know you're involved in that as well. So the second question we asked the people on the street to respond to was, why don't we know of the history of Juneteenth, and why hasn't that been taught? So I want to come back after we hear from those people and hear what you have to say in response to that question. So take a listen to what folks on the street had to say.
It became a state holiday in Texas in the 70s and was really seen as a Texas event, specific event. And so, and I'm not from Texas and haven't lived there, so I don't know how much it was taught in Texas, beginning certainly in the 70s, I would imagine, as it becomes a state holiday. But over time, it has been sort of adopted in other states as a kind of symbol of this broader historical moment. And so Juneteenth is unique in that way, in that it was specifically as a historic moment, a Texas event, but that has come to be a national symbol of those events. So I think while lots of people in states would have learned about emancipation, Juneteenth itself was still emerging as a sort of a potent symbol of that.
Slavery is shameful to this country that boasts of freedom. It's not a feel-good topic. We have the GOP now fighting about critical race theory. Well, this is part of critical race theory. First, people have to, in America, have to recognize that we had slavery to begin with, and that it is shameful to America. And so I don't know how it's going to be handled now that it's a national holiday. and I'm no longer in the classroom as a teacher. So I'm wondering, how will it be handled? How will they're going to try and sanitize it, I'm sure. But this is a story of Black people. This is a story of America. It is a shameful tale. And so they're going to, play up the freedom part, but it was an ugly story that brought this all about. I have no clue how it will be handled, but I know why it hasn't been. It hasn't been something that America wants to talk about.
But unfortunately, with Black history, you have to teach yourself. I taught myself, I took several courses. I actually teach a Black Studies course now at the high school. And, you learn something every year. But, I'm concerned because there have been attacks recently on the histories of Black and brown people. With critical race theory and everything else. A lot of states, particularly in the South, are now making it illegal to teach histories that, basically talk about one group being subjugated to another group. And so it's up to us to kind of carry the torch, those who know, and to teach others.
And one of the things that we were all talking about is that, in particular in the Commonwealth, right, we're asked to align our instructional decisions and select our curriculum materials in alignment with the curriculum frameworks. And so as recently as 2018, the social studies curriculum frameworks were revised and republished. And so we scanned them again because Juneteenth still is not there. Then we started to think about, when we do review and select, textbooks or supplemental materials, we looked at how references to Juneteenth have been made historically prior to being identified as a holiday or a day that we, are raising our consciousness about and talking about collectively. And in some textbooks, and this is at the publisher's discretion, it's either not included. In some cases, it's included, in the supplemental material. And I think that having the sort of rallying around our community and the openness that I think is a hallmark of Falmouth, right? That we see something and we say, okay, this is a gap in our curriculum. This is something we're not putting enough time and energy into talking about with our students. And we respond to that. So outside of, the frameworks not addressing it and our resources not addressing it, knowing that we can partner with our community and find the resources and educate each other to be able to educate our students, I think, right? Like that's what's bringing us there.
And, textbooks had the control on everything because, you got the basic information on American history, and then maybe off to the side, they had something on a sidebar, Martin Luther King or, someone else or whatever. Very, very little information given on Black history or women's history or history just in general of Black and brown people. But I think now with the internet, textbooks are very outdated. I know I don't even use one in my classroom anymore. All my sources are from the internet or primary sources.
Well, once again, thanks to our friends from the street there, for Krissie and Mark and Sonia, for helping to contribute to the conversation, especially around the question of, Juneteenth happened, 1865. That was the day when General Granger delivered General Order 3. We've heard, but very few of us know anything about it. I certainly didn't grow up learning anything about the importance of that day, the significance of that day. And so it begs the question, why is that? Why have we not taught that? So I'm going to go back to our educator from Boston, Lamerchi Frazier, with the African American Museum of African American History, and give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, there are varied reasons, I do believe, that can be applicable across the board in terms of the complexity of what slavery issued and its impact on the whole nation. We know that slavery was a contract by law, It was not just arbitrarily done. And so its economic impact was a part of what keeping the dominant narrative of what we learn in history about the founding fathers and the democratic principles and what the Constitution offers. Martin Luther King said that the Emancipation Proclamation and the Declaration of Independence were two of the most important documents ever issued in America. And the reliance on the language that is there is a part of keeping us in a space of looking and hoping for freedom, as it is very illusory. It's not something that we can say, oh, we got freedom now, do we? As it is ever going, and we can witness that across the last 2 months we've had in our own certain circumstances here in the 21st century. When we think about how the narrative of all are created equal plays out, and the belief in that as a systemic overall condition of being, all we need to do is look at the health and wealth gap of communities that have not been cared for in the ways that those who are at the top of the society have their needs met, and the profits that would be endangered by everyone knowing truth. When we think about that, we can be rest assured that those who are in control of the narrative and as it's played out, and the media being a part of that, that the curriculums that result from the dominant narrative being challenged, and I'm one of the people who has challenged, at least for 5 years, the Massachusetts standards and frameworks for public schools, and for teachers to know what slavery meant and how its implications affect us all, and that how all of our voices should be reflected in the curriculum, that this is no easy task. Teachers are afraid to teach what they don't know, and I would be too. So information and its authenticity, supported by evidence, documents, objects of African and Indigenous experience, have to be a part of the archive that curriculums are set up to teach our children. I don't know about you, but it was not my circumstance to know very much about slavery. There was one page in my textbook. I don't know if that's anybody else's experience, but I grew up in a segregated South in Jacksonville, yes, Florida.
Yes.
And when I thought about, what were the stories I was told, because my community cared about us and we had to have separate school systems, separate school boards and all of that, it was a very natural embrace of Black experience. In other communities, it is not. We have to take our stories seriously. Juneteenth is a moment to crystallize, to come together in unity. Yes, whatever way you want to acknowledge it, celebrate it, whatever you want to do with it. But to render it valuable is a part of what the dominant narrative doesn't do for us. So while we are now able to participate in an expanded narrative, and an expanded narrative of belonging, not just inclusion, that's to being invited to somebody else's party, but to be in a place of really belonging and taking up that space and knowing our possibilities, then we will know more and seek more about ourselves that is affirmative.
LaMercia, you better watch out now, because you going and challenging the folks that prepare the standards for curriculums, and you're going to get accused of teaching critical race theory now, and these teachers don't want to. I know you're ready for it. I know that.
Tell them, come on. We got the evidence. We got everything here. that's why we in trouble right now, because people didn't want to acknowledge it. You know,
Well, and that isn't
we
that
can
what's
only we can only
isn't that
meet
what's
hate with some education, some information.
yeah, that's what's happening now. They
You
don't
can't go
want
to the grocery store and the school, something's wrong.
some folks don't want to talk about it now, which is why we got all this noise about critical race theory. But I saw you wanted to get in there, Barbara. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. That's why I had the disclaimer in the beginning. My anthropology class is my BA from Rhode Island College. I am a critical race theorist. I took 2 senior seminars in critical race theory. And this is one of the reasons that I take every opportunity to add not just to the narrative, but participate like we did in the 3-day celebration or recognition in Falmouth this weekend. We had drumming on Saturday. We had Candida Rose and Jubilato on Sunday, Groovalatos singing and getting the place dancing. It was great to see a lot of Black folks, BIPOC folks enjoying and smiling to see us sit at the table, to see us sit at the drums. I thought we'd have 1 hour of drumming, but I brought them out at 10 o'clock in the morning, and people were sitting down interchangeably, Black, white, Indigenous. We were drumming from 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You couldn't stop it from happening. People were, their eyes were bright to see this. So I'm going to just coin the phrase from the late, great Aretha. What I try to do is gain respect for what we do. RESPECT, you know that. So why they don't want to talk about it, why it's not in the history books, is because slavery was America's original sin. We did not get respect in the Constitution. And as you heard in the beginning of this program, when I pointed out, even with the General Order 3, we were to remain in our places. When I got to college as an adult, they asked why I was in a history class, how many folks were there just because it was a required subject. And I raised my hand right away. And they said, what is it that you didn't like about history? And I said, because it didn't have anything to do with anyone who looked like me. I say that mantra all the time. They were white men on horses for the most part in wars. There were no Blacks celebrated, and there were no women celebrated, or none really to speak of. You give me something that I can recognize through these new history books that represent folks like me, and I'm sure I'll do better than the horrible mark I got in high school for that. And of course, I said I graduated magna cum laude. I got an A in history class at 45 years old. I'm telling you, I got a C in history class in high school, and my mother almost beat me silly. It's not just that we are trying to get the rest of the world to recognize that. We are trying to get the youth that are growing up today to be proud, to know that they deserve the respect that ending slavery should have given them.
I'll just say amen to that. So, Ambrose, I know you've spent a good part of your life, as Barbara was talking about, educating young people. I know you've had a deep commitment to making sure that talented young people of color have an opportunity to excel and to demonstrate their intellect and all. And so I know that's really near and dear to your heart. So what do you have to say about this whole subject of education and the lack thereof around slavery and Juneteenth and the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment?
Yeah. Well, I think that here again, it's an opportunity. And how we approach this, varies and can vary. And there's the informal and the formal approach to education. And I think the informal is just as important, perhaps more important than the
Absolutely.
formal in changing the minds and hearts and feelings of people.
Absolutely.
And so when I think about why we learn about Juneteenth and why it's important, and I do want to say, I'm one of those that say, let's celebrate. We got something to celebrate.
Yes,
From
we do.
everything I see, the former slaves, when they heard they were free, it was Jubilee. They celebrated.
Yes.
This is over, you know. It doesn't mean it wasn't horrible or horrific, but, you know, we can now take this and make of it of what we can and move on, knowing there are going to be obstacles. But I think that looking back to the founding of this country, say in 1790, when a citizen was a white male, a property owner, and that was a citizen. And the rest of us, including white women, we have had our freedom through amendments or acts, and that's still going on. We still have people who are wanting to keep us from voting, you see. And so this Juneteenth opportunity is an opportunity, I believe, to stay on narrative of citizenship and who is a citizen, and I am a citizen. And so to me, you know, that's very important. And so it's an opportunity. And I think that when we look at what we know and don't know, no one is up on Juneteenth, pretty much, you see. And unless you're a scholar and you focused on that. But Joe Blow America does not. So it's an opportunity from my point of view. And it's also, I believe, when we look at the whole notion, concept, and moral construct of freedom, of independence, of liberty, it is about an opportunity to explore still that for everyone. And so when I'm looking at it, what we got to get to, I think, is bringing on people, bring people together to still understand that our humanity is inextricably connected to each other. So you had 4th of July. Well, that was the lie, because if everybody's not free, it's not a celebration of freedom or independence. But now Juneteenth is an opportunity for us all to come together and say, okay, now if you're free and you have your independence, let's do this together, you know. And so it's an opportunity. And I think what we are seeing here too is those Texans outdistance everybody else. Folks who celebrated Emancipation Day at one time sort of let it fizzle. You know, and so, but the Texans stayed on message. And so let's grab this holiday, run with it, and sustain it for the right reasons, but have some fun along the way.
No one is free until we are all free, right?
Absolutely.
And we know that struggle continues. So I'm going to toss it to Angie in a minute, but I got to go back to the burning question that I had for years, and that is, why so long? Why 2.5 years, really, for supposedly the news to get to the folks in Texas? Because as Lamercia was saying, come on, those folks knew. That folks had to know. I mean, the black folks knew, the white folks knew. But, you know, the story is, oh, it took 2.5 years for it to get there. What do you say, Lamercia?
I say that it is a formal information being passed or being announced, but that as early as 1775, when the American Revolution was happening, and General Washington was considering whether Black should be patriots and given guns to fight for the American Revolution. There was a general in Virginia who said that you should do it. Washington was against it, but he said you should do it because not only are they avid fighters, but if they get news, you can rest assured that it can cover over 750 miles in less than a week, because they're avid. They are very apt at communication. And so for me, just looking at that was 1775, and then we go 100 years later, almost 100 years later, 90 years later, I know that their information and their activity in the Underground Railroad and the networks and organizations that happened, even with the aspect of having to keep it quiet, that there's news and it travels. And it travels very far distances as we find out more and more about how they were able to pass on information, to meet in places. When they supported John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, they met up in Canada. Harriet Tubman, Mary Ellen Pleasant from Nantucket was in California. She came to give $35,000 to John Brown for that raid. Douglas and others are in Chatham, Canada. So when we think about their ability to travel and the news, there's no doubt in my mind that they already knew, but that it had to be formally announced. And that was some of course, there are, many of us who are in the recesses of a place may not hear exactly what's going on, but we have some understanding. So 2 years, that's a long time when a place is under siege, like the Confederate States were. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah. We had the internet before they had the internet. We had Google and all that.
Exactly.
Drums.
Exactly.
Back to the drums.
The drums.
Right.
Stono Rebellion, all of that, right?
Come
We
on.
have the ability to do that.
But I think it's also the very simplistic answer of economics. I mean,
Yes.
they needed I'm sure. Oh, so many don't forget. Obviously, we know I'm just preaching to the choir. Forgive the pun, but many didn't read, write, all of that. The ones that were in the plantations, they didn't get all that information that I'm sure the overseers know, or the plantation owners knew, and everyone else knew. It was more economics. It was important to keep those folks on the plantations, and we know why. But so wonderful of Abraham Lincoln, of Major General Granger, to go down there and say, now we got to stop this. Mm-hmm. More the point to me is, why were those in power allowed to keep slavery going for 2.5 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why was there not some punitive event in some way, because they were breaking the law of the land, no matter what? Folks didn't have a lot of places to go. I understand that. People wonder, why would people stay on a plantation where there was slavery? It is a difficult thing. We see it now. We see it today with unfortunately, the lack of housing. Sometimes you stay in a very difficult position because you cannot find a way out. There should have been ways out made easier for the folks. But my biggest question here is, how were they allowed to keep slavery going for 2.5 years in America? And what possibly was done, again, punitive measures for them breaking the law?
Well, I think if I may jump in, I really appreciate that question, Barbara. The idea that property relationships are what America is founded on.
Sure.
It was the quest for land to so-called gain freedom from England. The idea that there were those who gained property by kidnapping of people and theft of the land. Then those who were being disavowed of their property, disassociated and taken off their land, what was called, quote unquote, in Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, the Indian soil, those who were being dispossessed of their land as indigenous people who were here all the while. And then those who were being deemed property as the African descended people. So these property relationships were the dynamics of this entire Civil War and the period of slavery. When we look at it, as you have so eloquently said, the economic factor and dynamic of what America is founded on, how it kept its profits for those of a particular class, and how that was the sustainable mark and goal. Lincoln said he was just interested in keeping the Union together.
Yes.
He wasn't interested necessarily in the humanitarian moral issue of slavery. He was interested in that this nation wouldn't divide itself. So,
Exactly.
you know, and that being the case, many of those who are property people are not going to be held into account. We can even look at the fact that in the state of South Carolina, the Confederate flag was allowed to wave as its state flag after the Civil War. And it is not until a courageous young Black woman mounts that pole. She drives an hour and a half from her hometown in North Carolina to South Carolina and mounts that pole and takes that flag down, that kind of courageous, like, we won't have it anymore. I'm tired, I'm not gonna have it anymore, is her declaration. And then her father, ironically, who was working for the Freedom Center, the Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Ohio, is challenged because he won't denounce his daughter's actions by the funders of that institution. He is actually fired because she mounted the pole. So for me, it is saying, it is a declaration of, I'm in power, I'm gonna stay in power by any means necessary on that side. So we have to meet that with, as Ambrose was saying, like the joy of celebrating ourselves and resisting that power of property relations, and us really take into account that our value and the way we occupy space also.
And I think too, on this question, and it's not to make it as an excuse, but I think as we examine critically, you know, the ending of slavery and the context that it was happening, and it has evolved, is we do have to take into consideration communication, mode of communication. We have to take into consideration geography. Texas at the time was, you know, that was on the edge of the frontier, so to say. And so there are those kinds of things. And so people got away with things that they might not have been able to get away with had it been in Virginia, you see. And I think that's part of maybe why it took 2 years. And I certainly think there was a strong economic dimension to it in terms of the slaves being viewed as property as opposed to as a human being.
Yes.
And there's no doubt about that, I think. But I think these are things, as we promote scholarship around the intricate and complexity of slavery and ending of slavery and its interconnectedness to who we are today, what's going on, and in the future, that we have to take that into consideration. And I think also it may be controversial, but unfortunately, I think that more often than not, what gets noticed, what gets pushed, what gets satisfied has to do with what white America wants. And basically, as I said, in 1790, a citizen was a white man, a property owner. So maybe it was a compromise, or we'll look the other way on this. And then there was a whole issue of, succession of the South from the Union, and the Union issues, and the complexity there. And as I said, which we are not addressing here, and nor do we need to focus on any one of these ending of slavery opportunities. There was the issue of what was going on also in the indigenous territories there, and what to do with those 10,000 slaves. And they didn't get their freedom until 1866. So it's a complex thing in terms of who owned slaves, who were willing to give them up, what value were these slaves as a piece of currency around this issue of the South and the North, or the succeeding. I mean, the South was about succeeding from the Union, and you had the Native Americans that went with the Confederacy, and you had African Americans who supported the Confederacy. And so it is very complex, is what I'm saying. Yes, it is. And there's more than enough for us to stay on, as opposed to sweeping things under rugs, or this thinking if you burn books or kill people or hang people or you outshout people, you're gonna keep them from their freedom or their curiosity, So, but anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, the white possessive logic is a term that it shows up those property dynamics that that you're espousing, what people claim as their privilege. This idea like that, it's called white supremacy, and I don't like to keep reinforcing any supremacy there. And so white possessive logic, this idea that I have the right to possess something, I have the right to determine my assemblies can give you soil of somebody else just because you asked for it and you asked me for the permission to occupy it, or the right to scout people in hunting parties and be a guaranteed document that says how much money you're going to get for it. This whole idea of the Western Hemisphere and the arrival of the Europeans with Christopher Columbus in 1492 is a part of that white possessive logic. I have the right to put you under my thumb, and I have the right to change your religion. I have the right to rename all your plants, whatever you already have names for. I have the right to subdue you because I can conquer you. All of that as a part of the plan for setting up this period of enslavement and domination. So,
and I think if we look at axiology, we look at epistemology, and we look at values, and it's all part, I think, of the scholarship of looking at this, is how we know. And when we look at individuals out of European cultures, or the European culture, we cannot ignore the fact that you are working with a people out of a value system of scarcity.
yes,
There was not very much that you could live on through the winter in those geographies. And that has had an impact on their value system and how they see people as an object, time as an object, money's an object, friendship's an object, love's an object. How good are you to me now?
okay.
I can put you aside if someone else comes on with something that has a higher value to me. And so the church participated in this. All of the institutions that make up these United States as we know them today participated in slavery. And so where was the church? If the government wasn't doing it, if the military wasn't doing it, where was the church in helping to get this information to Texas?
Right.
I only ask that, Will.
Yeah.
So when you're writing the guidebook for us, we need that. We need all the comments that you just made.
Where was that angel?
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I am so glad that we had you, Dr. Ambrose Gerald, you, Lamerchi, and Barbara on the show with us today, along with Reverend Will. This has been a fantastic conversation. I have learned so much. I look forward to going back and watching this show to pick up the things that I didn't hear the first time, to make more notes. So I really want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Reverend Will, for being here on your vacation. Thanks to Alan and Deb at FCTV for continuing to co-produce the show with us. And we look forward to seeing you all on another episode of The Conversation.